Hello my dear students, welcome to my YouTube channel Midslit. So today we are going to discuss about the types of communication based on its direction. So in the last session we have discussed the types of communication based on its organizational structure. So first we are going to discuss what is downward communication. A communication that takes place from superior to subordinates in a chain of command is known as downward communication. So a communication from principal to his teacher, his colleague, who is his subordinate. That kind of communication can be classified as downward communication. So such type of communication may be in the form of orders, instructions, and policies, programs, etc. It may be written or verbal. So that is the basic concept about downward communication. So next we are going to learn which are the messages can be categorized as downward communication. Confirmation regarding performance, work assignment or directions, orders, guidance and the responsibilities, ideological types of information, organizational procedure and practices. So all these type of messages, both orders, guidance, so all these messages are given by a superior to his subordinate. So all these messages can be classified as downward communication. So what are the advantages? What are the advantages of downward communication? We know that there are a lot of advantages of downward communication. It is helpful in controlling the subordinate. So through the communication of downward, we can control our subordinate and we can explain the plans and policies of the organization to my employees. And this downward communication is a tool to delegate authority. And it is very helpful to tie among employees at a different level also. It also encourages the effectiveness of upward communication through feedback. So downward communication is associated with upward communication also. So downward communication, so its reaction, its reply, its response, its feedback is called as upward communication. I will discuss what is upward communication sooner, and it helps. This downward communication helps in preparing the people to introduce a kind of change. So all these are advantages of downward communication. And next we are going to talk about the disadvantages of downward communication. We know that if there is any advantage, some kind of disadvantage will be there. So these are the disadvantages. Downward communication tends to promote one-way communication. So downward communication is a kind of one-way communication. There will not be spontaneous responses. That's why we say It always tends to promote one-way communication. And it is time consuming because sometimes information passes through various levels. So for example, if I report something to my, sorry, if I'm a principal of a college and I need to convey a message to my student, so I will pass my message to my department HODs, and after that they will forward the message to the class tutor, and finally the message will reach into the students. So downward communication can be manifested in various levels. That's why we call it is time consuming, because this kind of information passes through various levels. So sometimes a manager may filter the information or hold back some of the information due to fear that it might be unpalatable. So if I tell something to my student, so sometimes HOD cut the information, some of the information, due to the fear that it might be unpalatable. So that kind of danger is also there in downward communication. That's a disadvantage. And as communication takes time, sometimes message become ineffective. So we know that if we take more time to communicate, sometimes message become ineffective and can lose the significance of the communication. That is also one of the disadvantage of downward communication. So this is all about downward communication, and next I'm going to talk about what is upward communication. So when messages are transmitted from the bottom to the top of the organizational hierarchy, it is known as upward communication. So this is the opposite concept of downward communication. Downward communication is a communication from superior to his subordinates, but upward communication from subordinate to his superior. That is the difference. So downward communication is the opposite of upward communication. So the main function of upward communication is to supply information to top management. It is essentially participative in nature and can flourish only in a democratic organizational environment. So it may be in the form of a progress report, suggestions, grievances, complaints, etc. So the messages are like a kind of progress report, suggestions, grievance, complaints, etc. And what are the advantages? What are the advantages? We know that there will be some advantages for this kind of communication. So first advantages is management can use feedback effectively in their plan and procedures. So if we give some message to my principal, if I share some opinion to my HOD or principal, they can analyze my feedback and effectively plan their further procedures. That is an advantage. And another advantage is help the subordinate to communicate their views to the top management. So a kind of upward communication will help the subordinate staff to communicate their views to the top management. So using upward communication, I can communicate with my HOD, principal, and manager also. So that is very helpful. And it supports innovative ideas and suggestions. So an upward communication always supports some innovative ideas and suggestions. and it also support in harmony and mutual cooperation among management and subordinate. And another advantage is very important. The managers are able to evaluate the impact of communication. They can analyze, they can evaluate, they can interpret the impact of this communication. So these are the major advantages of upward communication. And the disadvantage. What are the disadvantages of upward communication? If there is some advantage, we know that definitely there will be some disadvantages. So there are some disadvantages of upward communication. Subordinate provides only favorable information to the upper management. Sometimes the subordinates provides only favorable information to the upper management. So the communication is limited sometimes. They are afraid to share some kind of information in some occasions, some circumstances. That is a disadvantage. And it may be discouraged due to a lack of proper response from top management. So if there is no feedback from the top management, if there is no downward communication against an upward communication, that is a disadvantage. That is a problem. If there is no feedback, the communication will not be effective. And it takes a lot of time to pass the message to a higher level. The same problem we have confronted in the case of downward communication. Sometimes it takes more time to communicate because there are a lot of levels. So that's why sometimes it takes more time to communicate. So taking more time to communicate will lose the effectiveness of the communication. That is very important disadvantage of upward communication. And sometimes it arises a threat that the superior may react negatively. So sometimes if I upwrite that, my principal will be angry towards me if I share some kind of message. So that is a disadvantage. There is a threat that the superior may react negatively. So these are the disadvantage of upward communication. Next type of communication is horizontal communication. What is horizontal communication? When communication occurs between two or more persons working at the same levels, it is known as horizontal communication. First, we have learned that what is downward communication. That is a communication from superior to inferior to downward. And the upward communication is a communication from subordinate to the superior and a kind of upward communication. But horizontal communication is a communication in between similar level, a communication between the same level. So when a communication occurs between two or more persons working at the same levels, it is known as horizontal communication. So this type of communication occurs mostly during committee meeting or conferences. So the main object of such communication is to establish interdepartmental coordination. So for example, I can give you one example for horizontal communication. So this is a communication between an assistant professor of commerce and an assistant professor of English. So same level of communication, but they because they are same level employees in an organization. That is horizontal communication. So advantages of horizontal communication is It helps in avoiding duplication of work. Sometimes it helps us to avoid the duplication of work because I'm doing some work and my colleague also doing some work. So if we communicate in between each other, we can avoid the duplication of work. We don't want to do the same work for both. So sometimes it also solves interdepartment conflict. So if there is some conflict in between interdepartments, so sometimes there is a confusion between me and my colleague in Department of Commerce in the case of common class. So we can solve that kind of conflicts through horizontal communication. And it facilitates establishing coordination between different departments of the organization. So that is very important. That's a good advantage of horizontal communication. And communication process is computed very smoothly without any barrier. So the communication will be more smoothly because this is not a communication in between a superior and inferior. This is a communication in between the staff who is working in the same level in an organization. So there will not be any communication barrier. The communication will be more smooth. And it helps in maintaining social and emotional support among the peer group. So these are the important advantages of horizontal communication. Obviously, there will be some disadvantage, and I'm going to talk about the disadvantage of horizontal communication. There is a lack of motivation to communicate. There will be a lack of motivation because I'm going to communicate with my colleague who will be a friend of mine more than my superior. I'm not communicating with my superior, so we will be more friendly. So there will be a lack of motivation, and usually they hide information due to rivalry between them. Sometimes there will be some enmity in between department. They don't want to share more information in between them. So that kind of threat is also there in horizontal communication. And it lacks authoritativeness because there is no superior, there is no inferior in horizontal communication. It is a same level communication, so there is no authorities. So it's also a disadvantage. If there is any authorities, the communication will be more serious and effective. So these are the disadvantages of horizontal communication. And a final type of communication based on the direction of the communication. So diagonal communication. Diagonal communication is an exchange of information between persons at different levels across departmental lines. There is So it's a communication, an exchange of information between persons at different levels across departmental lanes. No departmental lanes, no junior, senior. So these types of communication is used to spread information at different levels of an organization to improve understanding and coordination so as to achieve organizational objectives. Thus, whether persons who are neither working in the same department nor has similar level are communicating, it is said to be diagonal communication. It cuts across the level of organizational structure. So, diagonal communication always break all the bondages of structure or level. There will not be any level. So it's a communication beyond the departmental lines. And there are some advantages of diagonal communication. It increases organizational effectiveness, and it facilitates organizational change. It creates integrity and harmony in the organizations. That is very important. The creation of integrity and harmony in the organization. So it's a kind of communication in between a librarian to an assistant professor to an office staff. So that kind of communication is diagonal communication. It helps to speed up the action and save time. That's very important. Diagonal communication always helps to speed up the action and save time. That is very important in the case of diagonal communication. And there are some disadvantages of diagonal communication. It's sometimes it violates the principle of unity of command. That is very important. There will not be any principle of unity in the command, and it is an unsystematic manner of communicating. So sometimes it feels like unsystematic. There will not be any systematic approach in the communication. The communication in between the librarian and an assistant professor is sometimes it will be like more unsystematic. So these are the disadvantages of diagonal communication. So that's all about the classification of communication based on the direction of the communication. We have discussed 4 types of communication based on direction: downward communication, a communication from superior to inferior, and secondly, upward communication, a communication from subordinate to his or her superior, and third one is horizontal communication, communication in between same level employees, and finally diagonal communication, a communication beyond the departmental lines or levels. So these are the different types of communication and its advantage and disadvantage. I hope you enjoyed the session. Thank you. Have a nice day.